I'm Celeste, 36 now. Life has a way of changing in unexpected directions. At 14, my parents abandoned me at JFK Airport because I got a B- in advanced math. My father said, "That's what happens when you don't do your best," and walked away laughing. I never returned home, building a life on my own terms instead. 22 years later, they tracked me down, desperate and broken. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit subscribe and like if you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone you trusted let you down. I grew up in an affluent Connecticut suburb where success wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Our sprawling colonial house with its perfectly manicured lawn stood as a monument to my father James's achievements as an investment banker. From the outside, we appeared to be the perfect American family. Inside those walls was a different story entirely. My father ruled our household with unwavering expectations. He had attended Princeton, graduated at the top of his class, and built his career with ruthless determination. Nothing less than perfection was acceptable, and this standard extended fully to his only child. My mother, Diana, a former beauty queen who had given up her own ambitions when she married my father, stood by silently as he established these impossible standards. "Potential is nothing without execution," my father would say at the dinner table while reviewing my school assignments. "In this family, we don't settle for mediocrity." By age 5, I was already feeling the weight of these expectations. While other kindergartners were praised for participation, I was scolded for coloring outside the lines. When I brought home my first report card with all A's and 1 A-, my father didn't take me for ice cream like my friend Julia's parents did. Instead, he established a new study schedule that cut into my already limited playtime. As the years progressed, the punishments for academic imperfection grew more severe. When I received a B+ on a 6th grade science project, I wasn't allowed to attend my friend Sarah's birthday party, instead spending the weekend with additional study materials my father had prepared. My 12th birthday party was canceled after I scored 92% on a history exam. 98% and above earned celebrations, my father explained as if this was perfectly reasonable. The comparisons to my more successful cousins were constant. "William got accepted to the Young Leaders Summer Program at Yale," my father would announce during family gatherings, looking pointedly at me. "And Martha won the regional math competition again." The unspoken message was always clear. Why couldn't I achieve at their level? My life became an endless cycle of studying, testing, and struggling to meet impossible standards. I would stay up until midnight completing assignments, then wake at 5 to review before school. Weekends weren't for friends or exploration, but for academic enrichment activities and additional study. My childhood was disappearing beneath a mountain of textbooks and expectations. The only reprieve came during visits with my maternal grandmother Eleanor. Her small apartment in the city became my sanctuary. Unlike my parents, she asked about my interests rather than my grades. She kept an art set specifically for my visits, recognizing my love for drawing long before I dared mention it at home. "There's more to becoming a whole person than perfect scores, sweetheart," she would tell me while we sketched together at her kitchen table. "Find what makes your heart light up." With Grandma Eleanor, I could breathe. I could laugh. I could be a child rather than a performance metric. When she passed away suddenly from a heart attack when I was 12, I lost my only emotional support system. The only person who loved me unconditionally was gone, and the pressure at home intensified without that counterbalance. After her funeral, my mother found me crying in my room. Instead of comfort, she offered pragmatism. "Life doesn't stop for grief, Celeste. Your father expects you to maintain your GPA despite this setback." A setback. That's how they viewed the loss of the only person who truly saw me. In the 2 years following my grandmother's death, I retreated further into myself. School became my only focus because academic success was the only currency valued in our household. But secretly late at night, I continued to draw and paint, hiding my artwork between my mattress and box spring. Art became my silent rebellion, my private escape from the crushing expectations. By 14, I was enrolled in advanced placement classes across the board, sleeping barely 5 hours each night to keep up with the workload. My anxiety manifested physically in stomach pains and occasional panic attacks that I hid from my parents, fearing they would see these reactions as additional failures. I had no real friends because relationships required time I wasn't allowed to spare. I was isolated, exhausted, and drowning under the weight of expectations that no child should have to bear. Little did I know that a single grade was about to change everything. The trip to France had been dangled before me for months, a rare reward contingent on perfect academic performance. 2 weeks in Paris over spring break, my father announced at Christmas, assuming, of course, that your semester grades reflect proper effort. The unspoken threshold was clear: nothing less than straight A's would merit this family vacation. For months, I worked myself to exhaustion, staying up until 2 in the morning, studying for exams, skipping lunch periods to attend extra help sessions, declining every social invitation. My entire existence narrowed to this singular goal. The day before our scheduled departure, report cards were released. I sat in the school library, hands trembling as I logged into the student portal. My heart sank as the screen loaded English A History, A Biology, A Chemistry, A French, A Advanced Math B-, A B-, just 3 percentage points below an A, in a class 2 grade levels above my age group. The walk home that afternoon was the longest of my life. With each step I rehearsed explanations, apologies, promises to do better. When I entered our house, my father was waiting in the foyer, his face already set in familiar disappointment. "Let me see it," he said, hand extended for the printed report I carried. I watched his eyes scan the document, lingering on the offending grade. The paper crumpled slightly in his grip. "Advanced Math B-," he read aloud, his voice dangerously quiet. "Would you care to explain this failure?" My prepared defenses dissolved. "I tried really hard, Dad. The final exam had questions from material we haven't covered yet, and I still got 89%. "Excuses," he interrupted. "Your cousin Martin scored 97% in the same course last year." My mother entered from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's happening?" "Your daughter has decided that mediocrity is acceptable," my father replied, tossing the report card onto the entry table. "Perhaps we've been too indulgent." "The Paris trip?" my mother asked, her expression falling. "Clearly undeserved," my father confirmed. I felt tears threatening but forced them back. Crying would only compound my perceived weakness. "I'll do better next semester, I promise." "Too late for that," my father said, turning toward his study. "Success requires consistency, not occasional effort." I stood frozen in the foyer with my mother, who offered no comfort, only a disappointed sigh before returning to the kitchen. The sound of my father's study door closing echoed through the house, a familiar punctuation mark to these interactions. That evening, I picked at my dinner while my parents discussed their days as if nothing had happened. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "We'll still be going to Paris tomorrow," he announced. My head snapped up in surprise. "Really?" "The reservations are non-refundable," he explained, practical as always. "But consider this a lesson in consequences rather than a reward." Hope and apprehension battled within me as I packed that night. Perhaps this trip could still be a chance to reconnect, to prove my worth beyond academic performance. The flight to Paris the next morning was tense and largely silent. My attempts at conversation were met with one-word responses. My father buried himself in financial reports while my mother leafed through a travel magazine, occasionally pointing out landmarks we might visit. Our hotel room overlooking the Seine might have been magical under different circumstances. Instead, it became the backdrop for 3 days of emotional torture. My parents would leave early each morning, returning to collect me only for dinner, during which they would describe the sights they'd enjoyed without me. "The Louvre was magnificent," my mother commented on our second night. "You would have appreciated the architecture, Celeste." "Perhaps when she earns the privilege," my father added, cutting his steak with surgical precision. On the morning of the 4th day, my father announced a change of plans over breakfast. "We're cutting the trip short. Pack your things." Relief washed over me. This punishment had achieved its purpose. I was thoroughly miserable and determined to never fall short again. "When do we leave?" I asked. "Our flight is this afternoon," he replied, not looking up from his newspaper. The taxi ride to Charles de Gaulle Airport was silent. I stared out the window at the Parisian streets, mentally saying goodbye to a city I'd barely experienced. At the airport, we moved efficiently through check-in and security, my father leading the way with practiced confidence. Only when we reached the gate did I notice something odd. "This says New York," I observed, looking at the departure screen. "I thought we were flying to Hartford." "You're flying to New York," my father clarified. "JFK specifically." Confusion clouded my thoughts. "But our car is at Bradley International. How will we get home from JFK?" My mother avoided my gaze as my father checked his watch. "That's for you to figure out, Celeste." The realization dawned slowly then, all at once. "You're not coming with me. Your mother and I will be continuing our vacation as planned," he confirmed, his tone businesslike. "You'll be returning alone." Panic seized my chest. "But I'm only 14. I don't know how to get from JFK to Connecticut by myself." "Consider it a learning opportunity," my father replied, reaching into his wallet. He extracted a $50 bill and my house key, pressing them into my palm. "That should cover a bus ticket. The spare key is under the planter if you lose this one." My mother finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "There are frozen meals in the freezer." The boarding announcement came over the loudspeaker, saving me from having to respond. My legs moved mechanically toward the gate, passport and boarding pass clutched in my trembling hand. At the last moment, my father called after me. "Celeste." I turned foolishly, hoping for some word of care or concern. Instead, he smiled coldly. "That's what happens when you don't do your best." I boarded the plane in a daze, finding my window seat and staring blankly as the flight attendants performed their safety demonstration. 7 hours of solitary travel stretched before me, followed by an uncertain journey to an empty house. The reality of my situation crashed over me as the plane lifted off French soil. My own parents had abandoned me, not in a moment of crisis or financial hardship, but as a calculated punishment for academic performance they deemed insufficient. When we landed at JFK, I remained seated as other passengers gathered their belongings and deplaned. A flight attendant approached with concern. "Are you meeting someone, sweetheart?" I nodded automatically, the lie easier than explaining the truth. Clutching my small carry-on bag, I finally made my way into the terminal. The bustling airport overwhelmed my senses as I stood frozen, watching families reuniting with hugs and happy chatter. No one was waiting for me. No one was coming. I found a plastic chair near the arrivals board and sat, the $50 bill burning in my pocket. How far would that get me? Would it be enough for a taxi? A bus ticket? I had no idea how to navigate public transportation to Connecticut, especially after dark. Tears finally broke through as the magnitude of my abandonment settled in my chest. I tried to muffle my sobs with my sleeve, but the sound attracted attention from a passing security guard. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his name tag identifying him as Frank. I couldn't speak through my tears, only shaking my head. Frank crouched down to my level, his kind face creased with concern. "Are you supposed to be meeting someone?" "My parents." I managed between hiccuping sobs. "They're not coming." Frank's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "They know you arrived. Maybe they're stuck in traffic." I couldn't bring myself to explain that they were still in Paris, that they had intentionally sent their 14-year-old daughter across the Atlantic alone as punishment for a B-. The truth was too humiliating, too incomprehensible. Instead, I offered a partial truth. "They're not coming. I need to get home to Connecticut, but I don't know how." Frank studied me carefully. "Is there someone else we could call, another family member?" My Aunt Jessica, my mother's younger sister, lived in Brooklyn. We weren't close. My father had always dismissed her as underachieving because she worked as a public school teacher, but she was family. "My aunt," I said quietly. "She lives in Brooklyn." With Frank's help, I called Aunt Jessica from an airport courtesy phone. Her shock was palpable even through the receiver. "They left you at JFK alone." Her voice rose with each word. "Don't move, Celeste. I'm coming to get you right now." For the next 2 hours, I sat with Frank in the security office, picking at a candy bar he bought me from a vending machine. He didn't press for details, seeming to understand that some family situations defied easy explanation. When Aunt Jessica burst through the door, her curly hair wild and her eyes scanning frantically, I felt the first moment of relief since seeing my report card. Celeste. She enveloped me in a hug that smelled of chalk dust and lavender perfume. Are you okay? I nodded against her shoulder, unable to speak. After thanking Frank profusely, Aunt Jessica led me to her battered Honda in short-term parking. Once inside, she turned to me fully. What happened? Your message didn't make sense. The story spilled out in disjointed fragments, the the Paris trip, my father's cold smile as he sent me away. With each detail, my aunt's expression darkened. That's not punishment, Celeste. That's abuse. She started the car with a vicious twist of the key. You're staying with me tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. The drive to Brooklyn passed in a blur. Aunt Jessica called her partner Tanya from the car, explaining the situation in terse sentences, punctuated by expressions of disbelief. By the time we arrived at their modest apartment, I was physically and emotionally depleted. Tanya was waiting at the door, her round face creased with concern. I made up the sofa bed, she said, taking my small bag. Are you hungry, sweetie? I shook my head, though I hadn't eaten since the airplane meal hours earlier. The thought of food made my stomach clench with anxiety. That night, curled under an unfamiliar quilt on their pull-out sofa, I cried silently into my pillow. Not from missing my parents, but from the crushing realization that they had never truly loved me the way parents should. What kind of father abandons his child over a grade? What kind of mother stands by and allows it? For the first time in my life, despite the circumstances, I fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow's test or assignment. The relief in that simple freedom was my first hint that being abandoned might actually set me free. The next morning, sunlight filtered through unfamiliar curtains as I slowly remembered where I was and why. The sounds and smells of breakfast being prepared drifted from the kitchen, ordinary, comforting domestic activity that felt foreign after years of silent, efficient mornings at home. I found Aunt Jessica and Tanya in their small kitchen working in comfortable synchronization as they prepared pancakes and coffee. They paused when I appeared in the doorway, uncertain. Good morning, honey, Tanya said gently. Hungry? The simple kindness nearly undid me. I nodded, sliding onto a wooden chair at their small table. Halfway through breakfast, the phone rang. Aunt Jessica answered, her expression darkening as she listened. It's your mother, she said, holding out the receiver. My hand trembled as I took the phone. Hello? Celeste. My mother's voice sounded exactly as it always had, composed, slightly distant. I trust you made it home safely. The normalcy of her tone struck me as surreal. I'm at Aunt Jessica's in Brooklyn. A slight pause. I see. Well, that's fine for now. For now? I echoed. Your father and I will be returning next week as scheduled, she continued. You can come home when you're ready to apologize and commit to better grades. The pancakes turned to concrete in my stomach. Apologize. You left me at an airport. You made a choice, Celeste. Actions have consequences. The familiar phrase, one I'd heard throughout my childhood to justify various punishments, ignited something new within me. Not fear or shame, but anger. I got a B- in a high school class as a middle schooler, I said, my voice gaining strength. You abandoned your child in an international airport. My mother's sigh carried through the line. You're being dramatic. We gave you money for transportation and your house key. I'm 14 years old. Old enough to understand expectations, she replied. When you're ready to come home and commit to excellence, we'll discuss this further. The call ended with my mother promising to check in again tomorrow, as if we were discussing a minor disagreement, rather than child abandonment. Aunt Jessica watched me carefully as I set the phone down. What did she say? They want me to come home and apologize when they get back next week. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Apologize? Jessica slammed her coffee mug down. That's not happening. Over the next few hours, Aunt Jessica made a series of calls to her teacher friend, who was married to a lawyer, to Child Protective Services, and finally to my parents' home number to leave a message that I would be staying with her until further notice. The legal complications emerged quickly. My parents claimed I had run away after they reasonably disciplined me for poor academic performance. They argued that the $50 and house key proved they had provided for my return home, their version against mine, with their social standing and resources tipping the scales. After 3 days of consultations with a pro bono family lawyer, Aunt Jessica explained the difficult reality. We could fight this, Celeste, but it would be messy. Court appearances, testimony, your word against theirs. And because they're willing to take you back, they just want to save face, I said, understanding dawning. They don't want people to know what they did. The solution emerged as a compromise. I would formally agree to stay with Aunt Jessica and Tanya as my temporary guardians, while my parents would maintain legal custody and provide basic financial support. No official allegations of abandonment would enter the record. When my parents returned from their abbreviated European vacation, they sent my belongings to Brooklyn in neatly packed boxes. Everything was organized by category: clothes, books, school supplies. No personal note, no favorite stuffed animal I'd had since childhood, no acknowledgement of the emotional magnitude of what had transpired. Adjusting to life in Brooklyn was both challenging and liberating. Aunt Jessica's apartment was a fraction of the size of our Connecticut home, with no manicured lawn or country club membership. I shared a bathroom for the first time in my life and learned to navigate public transportation. But the crushing weight of expectation had lifted. Aunt Jessica herself, a math teacher, looked over my schoolwork not to criticize but to help. She expressed genuine delight when I showed her my hidden artwork, immediately clearing space on the refrigerator for my sketches. "You have real talent, Celeste," she said, examining a portrait I'd drawn of Tanya. "We should look into art classes." Enrolling at the local high school required paperwork and explanations, but Aunt Jessica handled everything with determined efficiency. On my first day, she walked me to the front entrance. "Just be yourself today," she advised, straightening my collar. "Not who they wanted you to be, who you actually are." The concept was so foreign that I stood speechless, considering the question, who was I when not defined by academic performance? The answer emerged slowly over the coming months. I was someone who loved art and literature, someone who enjoyed deep conversations about ideas rather than grades, someone who could make friends when not constrained by impossible study schedules. My first friend Zoe invited me to sit with her at lunch after we bonded in English class over a shared love of Jane Austen. Through her, I met others: Devin, whose sarcastic humor made me laugh for what felt like the first time in years; Amara, whose passion for social justice opened my eyes to worlds beyond academic achievement. At 16, I got my first part-time job at a local cafe, earning minimum wage serving coffee and pastries on weekends. The modest paychecks represented something profound: independence. With Aunt Jessica's encouragement, I opened my own bank account, the first step toward financial autonomy. Phone calls with my parents continued sporadically, always following the same pattern. They would ask about my grades, I would provide updates without detail, they would remind me that my place at home remained available when I was ready to meet expectations. The conversations never ventured into emotional territory or acknowledgement of what had happened. I began to recognize these calls for what they were: attempts to maintain control rather than genuine interest in my well-being. After each conversation, I would feel the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, the sensation of being measured and found wanting. But increasingly, I also felt something new: distance. With each passing month, the power they held over me diminished. By the end of my first year in Brooklyn, when my mother called with the usual script, I found myself responding differently. "Your place at home is still available," she said mechanically. "Thank you," I replied, "but I am home." The silence that followed contained multitudes. 4 years after being abandoned at JFK Airport, I graduated high school with honors. My artwork had won several local competitions, and my college applications included a portfolio that showcased both technical skill and emotional depth. On graduation day, I scanned the audience for my parents, though I had sent the invitation with little expectation of their attendance. Aunt Jessica and Tanya made up for their absence, cheering loudly enough to make me blush as I crossed the stage to receive my diploma. "We are so proud of you," Aunt Jessica said afterward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Not because of your grades or college acceptances, but because of who you've become." The distinction was significant. In their eyes, my worth wasn't determined by metrics or achievements, but by my character, resilience, and growth. This unconditional support had transformed me over the years from a fearful perfectionist child into a young woman with confidence and purpose. Later that week, a card arrived from Connecticut with my parents' names signed at the bottom. Inside was a generic, congratulatory message and a check for $500. No personal note, no acknowledgement of their absence at the ceremony. I deposited the money into my college fund without comment. When my acceptance letter from State University arrived with a substantial scholarship for art and design, my path forward crystallized. The campus was only 30 minutes from Aunt Jessica's apartment, allowing me to continue living with them while pursuing higher education. College opened new worlds of possibility. Without the shadow of parental disapproval, I flourished academically and socially. I joined the Campus Art Association, exhibited my work in student galleries, and discovered a particular talent for graphic design that combined my artistic skills with analytical thinking. In my sophomore year, I met Michael in a digital media class. He was studying computer science, but had enrolled in the course to improve his user interface designs. When he asked for my help understanding color theory, our conversation extended from the classroom to a nearby cafe and finally to dinner. Michael's family background stood in stark contrast to mine. Raised by supportive parents who celebrated his interests rather than dictating his path, he had developed a quiet confidence I found both attractive and unfamiliar. When he asked about my family after several dates, I hesitated before sharing the truth. "They abandoned me at JFK Airport when I was 14, I said, studying his reaction. "Because I got a B- in advanced math." His initial disbelief gave way to genuine outrage on my behalf. "That's not parenting," he said firmly. "That's abuse disguised as high standards." Hearing someone else name it so plainly was validating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Through Michael, I began to see my childhood through new eyes, recognizing patterns of emotional manipulation and conditional love that I had normalized. Our relationship progressed steadily through college. By senior year, we were discussing future plans that included graduate school for Michael and a design career for me. When we graduated, Michael with honors in computer science, me with distinction in visual arts. Aunt Jessica and Tanya sat with his parents in the audience, two families merging in support. My parents sent another impersonal card with a slightly larger check. This time I returned it with a brief note, "Thank you, but I don't need financial assistance." It was my first direct rejection of their attempt at involvement without engagement. After graduation, I accepted an entry-level position at a small design agency in New York, while Michael began graduate studies in software engineering. We rented a tiny apartment in Brooklyn not far from Aunt Jessica and Tanya. Our life together was modest but genuine, built on mutual respect and shared values. My career progression exceeded even my own expectations. The perfectionist tendencies instilled by my father when redirected toward work I genuinely loved became assets rather than burdens. Within 5 years, I had advanced to senior designer, then creative director, developing a reputation for innovative approaches and meticulous execution. When Michael proposed during a weekend trip to the Berkshires, my immediate joy was followed by a complicated question: would I invite my parents to our wedding? After several therapy sessions specifically focused on this decision, I concluded that their presence would undermine rather than enhance a day meant to celebrate love and connection. Our wedding was small but meaningful, held in a converted warehouse with fairy lights and wildflowers. Aunt Jessica gave a toast that left few dry eyes in the room, speaking of chosen family and the courage to create your own definition of home. As Michael and I shared our first dance, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with academic achievement or external validation. A week after our wedding, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was an antique silver picture frame, clearly expensive but with no accompanying note. I recognized my mother's taste immediately. The anonymous gift spoke volumes, still unwilling to engage directly, still maintaining the fiction that nothing significant had transpired between us. Michael and I purchased our first apartment a year later, a 2-bedroom in a family-friendly neighborhood. As we settled into married life, we discussed starting a family of our own, both excited and apprehensive about parenthood given our contrasting upbringings. "I know exactly what kind of parent not to be," I said as we painted the spare bedroom that might someday become a nursery. Michael kissed my forehead, leaving a smudge of blue paint. "You'll be amazing because you understand what children actually need." When our daughter Ellie was born 2 years later, the cycle of family was immediately broken. Looking into her tiny face, I made silent promises to love her unconditionally, to celebrate her unique qualities, rather than imposing expectations to create a home where security never depended on performance. As Ellie grew, I maintained the annual tradition of sending my parents a Christmas card with a family photo and brief update. I never expected or received a response, but the gesture represented my refusal to perpetuate bitterness. They would know their granddaughter existed even if they chose not to know her personally. Occasionally, Aunt Jessica would mention news of my parents gleaned from extended family my father had retired from investment banking. They still lived in the same house. My mother had become involved in charity work at their church. These details reached me like dispatches from a foreign country I once inhabited, recognizable but distant. By my early 30s, I had established my own design firm specializing in branding for nonprofit organizations. Our client list grew steadily, as did our team. Michael's software company had been acquired by a larger tech firm, providing us with financial security beyond what either of us had imagined possible. Outwardly, my life appeared charmed: successful career, loving marriage, beautiful daughter, comfortable home. But beneath the surface, the scars of abandonment remained. In therapy sessions that continued intermittently throughout adulthood, I worked through trust issues that manifested in various aspects of my life. "I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted during one session, "for people to walk away when I don't meet some unspoken standard." The healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt completely at peace with my past. Others, a simple trigger, a parent scolding a child too harshly in public, or a colleague's casual comment about helicopter parents, would reactivate old wounds. But gradually, the sharp edges of trauma softened. I established firm boundaries around contact with my parents, annual Christmas cards, acknowledgement of major life events, but no expectation of response or meaningful connection. It was a one-way relationship that protected me from repeated disappointment while honoring my own need for closure. By 36, I had reached a place of relative peace with my history. My design firm had grown to 15 employees, my marriage remained solid, and watching 8-year-old Ellie's uninhibited joy in both creation and learning validated every decision I'd made to break the cycle of conditional love. Then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything again. It began as an ordinary workday. I arrived at my design studio around 8:30, reviewing client presentations with my team before our first meeting at 10. My assistant Lisa knocked on my office door mid-morning. "Celeste, there are people in reception asking to see you. They don't have an appointment." "Clients?" I asked, scrolling through my calendar. "They say they're your parents." The words hit like physical impact. My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips, suspended in the sudden tension that gripped my body. 22 years since they'd abandoned me at JFK, almost a decade since I'd seen them at an awkward extended family funeral where we'd exchanged mere pleasantries. Did they say what they want? My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Lisa shook her head. "Just that it's important." My instinct was to refuse to protect the careful equilibrium I'd constructed over decades. But curiosity mingled with a strange sense of inevitability. Perhaps this confrontation had always been waiting to happen. "Give me 5 minutes," I said finally. "Then show them back." In those 5 minutes, I straightened my desk, compulsively checked my appearance in the small mirror behind my door, and called Michael. The call went to voicemail, so I left a quick message. "My parents are here at the studio. Don't worry, I'm fine. I'll call you later." When my office door opened again, I stood to greet them with as much composure as I could muster. The people who entered barely resembled the towering figures of my childhood memory. My father, once intimidating in his physical presence and authority, appeared diminished. His hair had gone completely white, his shoulders slightly stooped. My mother looked brittle, her carefully maintained appearance now reading as fragile rather than polished. They had aged beyond their years, I realized with surprise. "Celeste," my father said, his voice raspier than I remembered. "Thank you for seeing us." The formality struck me as absurd given our history, but I gestured toward the chairs opposite my desk. "Please sit down." An awkward silence filled the space between us. They took in my office with obvious curiosity, the design awards displayed on the shelves, the framed client testimonials, the wall of successful campaigns. I noted with grim satisfaction that my father seemed impressed despite himself. "You've done well," my mother offered tentatively. "Yes." I agreed without elaboration. "What brings you here today?" They exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Before either could respond, my father's face contorted suddenly. His hand clutched at his chest, eyes widening in alarm. Then he collapsed forward, sliding from his chair onto my office floor. "James!" My mother's scream jolted me into action. I rushed around the desk, shouting for Lisa to call an ambulance as I knelt beside my father's prone form. His eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing labored. Years fell away as primitive fear overtook rational thought. Regardless of our history, this was my father dying before my eyes. The paramedics arrived with efficiency, quickly assessing his condition as they transferred him to a stretcher. Heart attack, they suspected, requiring immediate hospitalization. Without conscious decision, I found myself following my mother into the ambulance, holding her trembling hand as we sped toward New York Presbyterian. In the chaotic emergency department, my mother's facade finally crumbled completely. As doctors whisked my father away through swinging doors, she turned to me with naked desperation. "He's dying, Celeste," she sobbed, makeup streaking down her lined face. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. They gave him weeks, maybe a month." The revelation stunned me into silence. Cancer. Terminal cancer. Not a sudden heart attack, but the culmination of a diagnosis they had been carrying. "Why are you here?" I finally managed to ask. "After all this time?" My mother collapsed into a molded plastic chair, suddenly appearing every one of her 70 years. "It was James's idea. He wanted to see you before—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He wanted to make things right." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Make things right. After 22 years. Please," she whispered. "Just give us a chance." Hours passed in the sterile waiting room, the tension between us occasionally broken by update from medical staff. The heart episode had been brought under control. They were running additional tests. He was stable for now. As we waited, my mother filled the silence with hesitant revelations about their lives over the past 2 decades. My father had retired early due to initial health concerns 5 years ago. They had traveled extensively until his diagnosis 6 months prior. They had followed my career through industry publications and mutual acquaintances, saving clippings of interviews and awards announcements in a dedicated folder. "We tried to find you that day," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the hospital ambient noise. "At the airport. When we got back to the hotel that night, your father was beside himself." I stared at her in disbelief. "You abandoned your 14-year-old daughter in an international airport with $50. "It was a terrible mistake," she admitted, tears flowing freely now. "We called the airport as soon as we returned to the hotel, but you had already left with Jessica. Then it became complicated with her involvement and the legal issues." "You told CPS I ran away," I reminded her coldly. "You lied to protect yourselves." She didn't deny it. "Your father has regretted that day every day since. It destroyed him, Celeste. It destroyed us both." Before I could process this claim, a doctor approached with news that my father was conscious and asking for me. Alone. I followed the white coat down sterile corridors, my thoughts churning. What could he possibly say after all this time? What could possibly repair what they had broken? My father lay connected to various monitors, his complexion gray beneath the fluorescent lighting. When he saw me, he attempted to sit up, triggering a coughing fit that required the nurse's intervention. 15 minutes, she warned me gently. He needs to rest. When we were alone, my father extended a hand weakly toward me. I hesitated before stepping closer, not taking his hand but allowing him to see me clearly. Celeste, he said, his voice a shadow of its former authoritative tone. You look like your grandmother. The unexpected comparison to my beloved Grandma Eleanor disarmed me momentarily. Why am I here? I asked directly. He closed his eyes briefly. Because I'm a coward who waited until it was almost too late. Opening his eyes again, he met my gaze directly. I made a terrible mistake that day at the airport. The worst mistake of my life. A mistake is forgetting to pick someone up, I countered. What you did was deliberate abandonment. He nodded slowly. Yes, it was cruel and inexcusable. The simple admission without justification or deflection caught me off guard. The father I remembered never acknowledged wrongdoing. We tried to find you that same day, he continued. When we returned to our hotel, I realized immediately what I had done. We called the airport, but you had already left with Jessica. And then you told authorities I ran away. Shame crossed his features. Another terrible choice. We were afraid of legal consequences of public humiliation, but mostly afraid that we had damaged you beyond repair. You were right about that part, I said quietly. My father's eyes filled with tears, something I had never witnessed in my childhood. I've watched your career from a distance. Every award, every mention in design publications. I've been so proud of you, Celeste. Proud? The word triggered long, dormant anger. You abandoned me because I wasn't perfect enough. You don't get to be proud now. Not proud despite what happened, he clarified weakly. Proud because of what you did with your life afterward. You succeeded not because of my toxic expectations, but by freeing yourself from them. The monitor beeped as his heart rate increased slightly. He took a labored breath before continuing. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just needed you to know before I die that I recognized my terrible failure as a father, and that not a day has passed that I haven't regretted what I did to you. The raw honesty in his voice penetrated defenses built over decades. This dying man was not the towering figure who had defined my childhood through fear and impossible standards. He was just a flawed human being facing his final reckoning. I have a daughter, I said suddenly. Ellie. She's 8. Something like wonder crossed his face. A granddaughter. She doesn't know you exist, I continued, because I've never wanted her to feel that her worth depends on perfection. He nodded slowly, pain evident in his expression. You broke the cycle. That may be the only good thing to come from my failure. A nurse appeared in the doorway, signaling that our time was ending. I stood to leave unexpectedly conflicted. The confrontation I had occasionally imagined over the years had never included my father's imminent death or his unqualified acknowledgement of wrongdoing. At the door, I paused. How long? Weeks, according to the latest scans, he replied, though today's episode may have shortened even that timeline. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. Celeste, he called as I stepped into the hallway. Would you consider letting me meet her Ellie just once before? The request hung in the air between us. A month ago, I would have refused immediately. Now uncertainty replaced conviction. I'll think about it, I said finally, and left him to his machines and regrets. In the waiting room, I found my mother speaking quietly on her phone, presumably updating whoever was watching their house in Connecticut. She ended the call when she saw me. Is he? She began anxiously. Resting, I assured her. The nurse is with him. Relief visibly washed over her. Then hesitantly, will you come back tomorrow? The question encompassed far more than a hospital visit. Would I open the door to reconciliation, however brief it might be given my father's prognosis? Would I allow them back into my carefully constructed life? I need to discuss this with my husband, I said finally. And I need time to think. She nodded, clearly having expected outright rejection. Of course. We're staying at the West Side Hotel Room 614. However you decide. As I left the hospital, I called Michael, who had received my earlier message and was waiting anxiously for an update. I explained the situation in halting sentences, still processing the day's events. "Do you want me to come meet you somewhere?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "No, I'll come home," I replied. "We need to talk about this as a family." That evening, after Ellie was asleep, Michael and I sat at our kitchen table with mugs of tea, discussing the complex implications of my parents' sudden reappearance. "What do you want to do?" Michael asked after hearing the full account. "Not what you think you should do, but what you actually want." The question gave me pause. What did I want? Part of me wished to maintain the boundaries that had protected me for decades. Another part recognized the finality of death and the potential for closure that might never come again. "I think I want to hear them out," I said finally. "Not for them, but for me. And maybe for Ellie too." Michael covered my hand with his. "Then that's what we'll do. Together." The next day, I called my mother and invited them to dinner at our home the following evening with clear conditions. The visit would be brief. Ellie would be present only for a short introduction, and any attempt to establish unreasonable expectations would end the reconciliation immediately. When they arrived at our doorstep, my father leaning heavily on a cane, I was struck again by their diminished presence. Ellie coached carefully about meeting these old friends of Mommy's, offered a polite greeting before returning to her room to finish homework. The dinner was awkward, but civil. My parents asked appropriate questions about our lives, admired our home, and made no references to grades, achievements, or expectations. My father, clearly weakened by his hospital stay and underlying illness, ate little, but watched the family interactions with evident fascination. "You have a beautiful family," my mother said as Michael cleared the dessert plates. "You've created something wonderful here." "Yes," I agreed, meeting her gaze directly. "I have." For the first time, I saw genuine regret in her eyes, unobscured by justification or social propriety. In that moment, I glimpsed what these decades might have cost her as well, the relationships destroyed by rigid adherence to my father's warped values, the grandchild. She never knew the daughter she had lost through her own complicity. As they prepared to leave, my father asked quietly if they might see me again. The question hung between us, weighted with history. "Yes," I said finally, "but we take this slowly." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opening, a small crack in a door long sealed shut. Over the following weeks, my father's condition deteriorated rapidly. He moved from the hotel to a hospice facility, the cancer advancing despite aggressive pain management. My mother took a room nearby, spending her days at his bedside. I visited several times each week, our conversations gradually moving from safe topics like weather and current events to the more difficult terrain of our shared past. With death's presence sharpening honesty, layers of pretense fell away. During one visit, while my mother was speaking with the hospice administrator, my father asked about my sessions with the therapist I had mentioned. "Does it help?" he asked. Talking about what happened. I considered the question seriously. It's helped me understand that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and that it's possible to acknowledge someone's humanity without excusing their actions. He nodded slowly. "I've often wondered how differently things might have turned out if I'd had that kind of help years ago." After a pause, he added, "My father believed therapy was for the weak." Another toxic lesson I absorbed and passed on. This glimpse into the origins of his behavior opened a new dimension of understanding. During subsequent visits, my mother shared more about my father's upbringing, the military father who measured love in accomplishments, the emotional abuse disguised as building character, the pattern established long before I was born. "It doesn't excuse what we did," she said as we shared coffee in the hospice garden. "But James was repeating the only parenting he knew, and I was too weak to stand against it." "Why didn't you try to contact me directly over the years?" I asked a question that had lingered since their reappearance. "The Christmas cards were never returned. You knew where I was." She stared into her coffee. Shame, she admitted. And fear that you'd reject any overture. As time passed, it seemed increasingly impossible to bridge the gap. So why now? James received the diagnosis 6 months ago. At first, he refused to consider reaching out, believing you would never want to see him again. But as the end approached, she swallowed hard. He couldn't bear to die without at least trying to make amends. Though my father was too weak to visit my design studio in person, he asked repeatedly to see my work. I created a digital portfolio which my mother displayed on her tablet during one visit. His genuine interest and pride, expressed without the critical overlay that had characterized his responses to my childhood achievements, felt like a strange gift, too late, yet still meaningful. One afternoon I arrived to find him sleeping. His breathing labored. My mother looked up from her chair beside his bed, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "He's been asking for you," she said softly. "He has something to give you." When he woke an hour later, he gestured weakly toward a drawer in the bedside table. My mother retrieved an envelope yellowed with age. "I wrote this 15 years ago," he explained, his voice barely audible. "After seeing an article about your first design award, I never had the courage to send it." Later, alone in my car, I opened the letter with trembling hands. The pages contained what I had needed most as a child: an unqualified apology, acknowledgement of the damage inflicted, and recognition of my inherent worth separate from achievement. He had carried this unsent message for 15 years, a private admission of failure that changed nothing and everything. My next visit included Michael and briefly Ellie. My father's joy at this small family gathering was evident despite his weakness. He listened attentively as Ellie described her art class project, offering encouragement without a single mention of grades or competition. "She has your creativity," he observed after Ellie had said goodbye, "and none of my darkness." 2 days later, my mother called early in the morning. "The doctors say it's time," she said simply. "He's asking for you." I arrived to find him conscious but clearly transitioning. The hospice nurse explained gently that he was unlikely to last through the day. Taking the chair beside his bed, I held his frail hand as my mother stepped out to give us privacy. "I've been thinking about that trip to Paris," he said, his voice surprisingly clear. "Do you remember the boat tour we took your first night there, before everything went wrong?" I searched my memory. "The Seine at sunset. You pointed out architectural details I wouldn't have noticed." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You asked such insightful questions. I was proud of your curiosity." The admission hung between us, a glimpse of what our relationship might have been without the distortion of impossible expectations. "I never stopped loving you, Celeste," he continued. "Even when I couldn't show it properly, even when I was causing you pain." "I know," I said, surprised to find I meant it. In his broken way, within the constraints of his own damage, he had loved me. The knowledge didn't erase the harm, but somehow existed alongside it. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound his labored breathing and the soft beep of monitors. Then, with effort, he spoke again. "Thank you for allowing me to make some small amends. It's more than I deserved." "Rest now," I said, squeezing his hand gently. My mother returned, taking her place on the opposite side of the bed. Together we witnessed his final hours, the rasping breaths growing further apart until, as afternoon light filled the room, they stopped altogether. In death, his face relaxed, the lines of ambition and regret smoothing away. I reached across to take my mother's hand as she wept, our joined hands resting on his still chest, a family circle completed too late yet somehow right on time. The funeral was small but dignified, attended primarily by former colleagues and distant relatives. At my mother's request, I spoke briefly, choosing to acknowledge both the complexity of our relationship and the courage it had taken him to seek reconciliation at the end. "My father taught me many things," I said, looking out at the scattered mourners. "Some lessons were harsh, others valuable. In his final weeks, he taught me perhaps the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to acknowledge mistakes and seek connection, even across decades of silence." Afterward, as guests dispersed, my mother approached uncertainly. What happens now, Celeste? The question contained multitudes. Would I maintain contact? Would she have a place in Ellie's life? Could we build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed? I don't know exactly, I answered honestly, but I'm willing to find out. 1 year after my father's death, I sat in my therapist's office reflecting on the unexpected journey of reconnection and complicated grief. I never imagined having my mother in my life again, I admitted, let alone as someone Ellie calls Grandma. My mother had moved from Connecticut to a small apartment 15 minutes from our home. The transition hadn't been seamless. Decades of emotional distance couldn't be erased by proximity alone. But gradually, cautiously, we were building a new relationship unbound by the toxic patterns of the past. How do you feel about that relationship now? My therapist asked. It's still complicated, I acknowledged. There are moments when old resentments surface, but mostly I'm grateful for the chance to redefine what family means on my own terms. Therapy had been essential in processing this unexpected chapter. Through guided sessions, I came to understand that the airport abandonment, while traumatic, had also forced a kind of independence that shaped my eventual success. If they hadn't left me at JFK, I might never have escaped that pressure cooker, I reflected during one session. I might have continued trying to meet impossible standards until I broke completely. This reframing didn't excuse their actions, but allowed me to recognize how adversity had ultimately strengthened me. The abandonment that was meant as punishment became ironically the catalyst for building a better life. This perspective informed a series of mixed media artworks I created that year titled Points of Departure. The collection, featuring airport imagery combined with fragments of my father's posthumously delivered letter, received critical acclaim when exhibited at a small gallery in Soho. Your work speaks to anyone who's had to rebuild after loss, the curator told me at the opening. It's about abandonment, yes, but also about reclamation and self-definition. The unexpected success of this deeply personal project led to a professional evolution as well. While maintaining my design firm, I established a scholarship fund for teens from difficult family situations, particularly those pursuing creative fields despite parental opposition. Throughout this period of reflection and creative growth, Michael remained my steadfast support, neither pushing forgiveness nor holding me back from it. This is your journey, he said simply. I'm just here to walk beside you. With his encouragement, I undertook a personal pilgrimage that had been forming in my mind for months, finding Frank, the airport security guard, who had helped me 23 years earlier. Through persistent searching and the help of JFK's Human Resources Department, I located him now, retired, and living in Queens. Our reunion at a diner near his home was emotional for us both. Frank, now in his 70s with silver hair and the same kind eyes I remembered, embraced me like a long-lost relative. I've wondered about you all these years, he admitted over coffee. Whether you were okay what happened after your aunt came. When I shared my journey, college, career, family, and eventually the reconciliation with my parents, tears welled in his eyes. You know, in this job you see all kinds of things, he said. Mostly you never find out what happens next. To know that scared girl turned out so well. He shook his head, unable to continue. You made a difference that day, I told him. You showed me kindness when I needed it most. Before parting, we took a photo together that now sits on my office desk, a reminder that sometimes help comes from unexpected sources, and that small acts of compassion can change trajectories. The final step in my healing journey came unexpectedly. My mother suggested we visit JFK together, returning to the scene of the abandonment that had altered all our lives. Are you sure? I asked, concerned about her motivation. I need to face it, she said simply. And maybe you do too. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, we stood in the international arrivals area, the space both familiar and foreign after so many years. Travelers rushed past, unaware of the significance this ordinary terminal held for us. It was right here, I said, indicating a spot near a row of plastic chairs. This is where you left me. My mother's face crumpled, tears flowing freely. I'm so sorry, Celeste, I was a coward that day, and for too many days afterward. For the first time, I reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that acknowledged both the pain inflicted and the possibility of moving forward. "I know," I whispered. "I know." Standing there in the airport that had witnessed my abandonment, I felt a strange sense of completion. The 14-year-old girl left behind with $50 and a house key had survived, had thrived, had created a life built on authentic connection rather than achievement. Life continues to unfold in ways I couldn't have predicted. My relationship with my mother remains a work in progress, with moments of connection interrupted by occasional echoes of old patterns. Ellie has embraced her grandmother with the uncomplicated acceptance that children offer, though I remain vigilant about ensuring their relationship develops on healthy terms. Recently, while helping Ellie with a drawing project at our kitchen table, I watched her frustration as a line didn't curve exactly as she intended. "It's not perfect," she complained, reaching for an eraser. I gently stayed her hand. "It doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful," I told her. "Some of the most interesting art comes from unexpected lines." She considered this, then continued drawing with renewed confidence. In that moment, I felt the powerful reality of generational patterns broken. My daughter would never measure her worth by impossible standards or fear abandonment for falling short. The journey from that terrified 14-year-old at JFK to the woman I am today hasn't been linear. There are still moments when insecurity surfaces, when I question my inherent worthiness, when the fear of conditional love creeps back. But these moments grow less frequent, less powerful. I've learned that healing isn't a destination, but a practice. That forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. That creating your own definition of family sometimes means leaving behind what hurts while carrying forward what heals. Above all, I've learned that while abandonment shaped me, it doesn't define me. My worth was never determined by a grade on a report card, by parental approval, or by professional accomplishments. It was always there, waiting to be recognized by the person who mattered most, myself. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after someone you trusted let you down? How did you find the strength to create something new? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience. And remember, sometimes the most painful departures lead to the most meaningful destinations. Thank you for listening, and may you find peace with your own story wherever it has taken you.